Hey everybody, today I'm talking about Inish, which is a 2016 release board game designed by Christian Martinez and published by Matago Games. This one accommodates 2 to 4 players and takes around an hour to play. So the main mechanisms in this game are area control and card drafting, and the game is going to look a bit like this once it's set up. So you have this map made up of these modular tiles, which all have these different landscapes. So you've got your stone circle here, you've got your Lost Vale and your mountains, and this is going to change from game to game depending on the setup you choose or randomly pick. Each game is going to start with a capital represented by this big kind of plastic miniature here. And you've got these sanctuaries as well, which can come into play and be quite important for win conditions. And each player is going to deploy some pieces onto the board during setup. You are also going to pull out these advantage cards from this deck of cards here, which match the different landscapes. So as you can see, you've got mountains, Lost Vale and Stone Circle. I pulled out the matching cards for those, and that can give the player controlling those regions a bit of a boost and a bit of a power to use throughout the game, should they control that region. Each player is going to have their supply of pieces, and there are a few different decks here as well. So you've got this deck of kind of action cards, which are going to be used from round to round. You've got these epic tale cards, which can give you kind of real powerful abilities. And of course, those advantage cards I mentioned earlier. And in addition to all of these modular tiles here, you've got a bunch more that can come into play. You've got these deeds tokens, which can give you a bit of a boost when it comes to winning. And you've got these pretender tokens, which again are going to be quite important throughout the game. So let's talk about how the game actually plays out. So each round of this game is broken into 2 pretty distinct phases, the first being the assembly phase and the second being the season phase. And these card references are really good. They're a good aid to help you understand how each round is broken down. So in the assembly phase, it's pretty simple. You're going to have a look who is the dominating faction, where the capital is. So as you can see here, the orange player is the only person there. So they are dominant, but say the blue player only had 1 in there, because the orange player has 2, they're still going to be dominant. So whoever's got the majority is going to be the Bren. And the Bren is kind of a little useful tool that gives that player a little bit of a tie-breaking rule when it comes to winning. So being the Bren is often quite advantageous. And after that's done, you are going to have a look at all the different terrain types here and see who is the dominant faction. So again, the orange player controlled the Lost Vale, so they would take the Lost Vale card, which can give them a bit of a boost. The Stone Circle is controlled by the blue player, so they would get the Stone Circle card, and the Mountains is controlled by the white player, so they would get the Mountains card. And let's just take a little look at what these kind of things can do. So for example, the Mountains means that whenever somebody moves into the mountains, you would normally have to basically kill a clansman, so basically to represent how dangerous that terrain is. And I should say that not all of these different boards have a special rule on them, but some of them do. But the Mountains, if you control that region, you are not going to have to forfeit that player piece. So you've got an advantage there, so you don't have to suffer a casualty should you choose to travel through the mountains. The Bren is then going to flip this flock of crows tiles just like a coin, and wherever it lands is going to determine the turn order. So it's going to start with the Bren and then go clockwise in this example, but the other side shows anti-clockwise. And that can be important for a number of things. And finally, after that, you are going to shuffle, or the Bren is going to shuffle these action cards, and there are going to be 4 action cards per player, plus 1 in this deck. So you've got a pretty good idea what's going to be in here, and you're going to dish out 4 cards to each player, and then a draft is going to start. So if you're familiar with this channel, you're probably aware about how card drafting works, but once each player has been given their 4 cards, they're going to select one of those cards. So let's say, for example, this player wants to choose this migration card. They would put it to the side and then pass the rest of them to the next player, meaning that when this player is done, they're going to get a new bunch of 3 cards. However, Inish works slightly differently, where the card that you've set aside in the previous drafts is not locked in place. You can actually choose to put that back into the fold and then pick another 2. So in my second turn, I could say, oh, I'd actually pick these 2 and leave the migration card that I had in the first round back and pass it on to the other player. So you're actually not as restricted into staying on a certain strategy path on the draft you've previously picked. So that's quite a nice little change there, and gives you a little bit more freedom and flexibility to adjust as you go throughout your drafts. So once each player has their 4 cards and added their advantage card to the fold, then the actual main part of the game is going to start taking place. Starting with the Bren, you're going to start choosing these action cards and resolving the action on them, and with the purpose of trying to win the game, of course. So let's talk about the actual winning conditions of Inish, because it's quite unusual and a bit unlike anything else out there. So there are basically 3 different ways you can win this game. The first is to be in a region with, or be in regions with at least 6 shrines in there. So you've got these, or sanctuaries I should say. So these little sanctuary tokens are going to be, you're going to start with a couple on the board, or maybe just one. And as the game goes on, there's going to be more and more built on there. And if you're ever in regions, doesn't matter how many people you have in there, but just in regions with at least 6 sanctuaries, then that is going to be a potential end game trigger. The second one is to basically dominate other players. So for example here, these 2 white clansmen are actually dominating this region, and they have 1 player or 1 piece under them, meaning that they've got 1 of their 6 that they need to do in order to get another win condition. So if you are ever controlling the clansmen or 6 other clansmen of other players, then that is another endgame trigger and a potential winning condition. And the third one is rather simple, where you just need to be present in 6 different regions. So as I mentioned earlier, you start with 3 of these regions, but there is potential for it to grow quite a bit larger. So without going into too much detail, let's take a look at what some of these cards actually do. And as you can see here, the cards are beautifully illustrated and are quite striking, but we'll touch on that a little bit later. So let's start with this Sanctuary card here. So as I mentioned, one of the win conditions is to be present in regions where there are at least 6 sanctuaries. And this one simply lets you place a sanctuary somewhere on the board where you're present. So you have got this big supply of sanctuaries that can be deployed onto the board, meaning that the game state is going to change. And when you play this card, you're going to draw an Epic Tale card. Now this is another deck in the game, represented by these reddish cards here. And whenever you draw one of these Epic Tale cards, you are going to just put them in your hand, and you can actually keep hold of these for as long as you choose not to use it. So unlike these normal action cards, which would normally get discarded at the end of the turn whether you use them or not, these ones are always going to be available to you. And these are generally quite a bit more powerful than these standard cards, but sometimes a bit more circumstantial. But we'll touch on a few of these a bit later. You've also got this like Conquest card here, which are kind of the more aggressive cards. So if you have these symbols in the corner, like with these crossing swords, it normally means that you're going to move in and start encroaching on another player. So this one here says like you choose a territory and you can move any number of your clans from adjacent territories into it and start a clash. So a clash is basically the combat system of this game, which again I'll touch on a little bit later. The Geist here lets you cancel the ability of another player's action card, so you can kind of veto the effect if it's going to affect you negatively. You've got the Migration card here that lets you move around and potentially start fights. You've got the Festival, which is a bit of a protection mechanism, which basically means that you put this token somewhere, and if somebody starts a fight in that region, then they have to basically suffer a casualty before the fight even takes place. You've got the Bard card here that lets you draw an Epic Tale card, or you'll notice that some of these cards have 2 abilities on them. This kind of tree symbol means that you choose it as a basic action, but these other ones are kind of a reactionary move, where if somebody does a certain thing, then you can play this card as a response to that. So this one says, after one of your maneuvers removes one of your opposing clans, you can gain a Deeds token. And these Deeds tokens are really useful because they basically proxy one of the winning conditions that you would need. So as I said, normally you'd have to be present in 6 regions, for example, to win the game. But if you had one of these, you'd only need to be present in 5 regions. You've got the New Alliance here. That basically means that you can place a clan member, or where an opponent has 2 clan members, you can replace one of them with your own. You've got the Craftsmen and Peasants here, which means that you can, wherever you're present, you can place a clan member for each territory in that for each citadel in that territory. Sorry. So in addition to the capital and the sanctuaries, you've got the ability to place these citadels down. You've got the let's have a look here. You've got the New Clansmen here, which basically lets you place two clans in any territories where you're present. You've got the Druid here, where you can go through the discard pile and pick an action card that's already been used. You've got the Warlord here that lets you start fights and initiate a clash, or when you've or during a clash where you're involved. After a maneuver is performed, you can place one exposed clan into a territory and choose who performs the next maneuver. So it gives you a lot of fighting power there, but I'll go into a bit more detail on that one in a minute. You've got the citadel here that lets you place the citadel on the board and potentially steal the advantage card associated to that location if it's not been played yet. And you've got the exploration card here, where the Bren chooses an area adjacent to 2 regions and places a new region tile onto the board like so, and you draw the corresponding advantage card from the deck, and of course whoever controls that region in the future is going to get that advantage card ready for the next round. So let's have a brief look about how combat works in this game, because although this isn't a massively confrontational and in-your-face combat style game, it can be quite pivotal in determining who has the advantage throughout the game and controls certain regions. So let's say, for example, this player here, the blue player, plays one of these conquest cards, which means you can choose a territory and move any number of your clans from adjacent territories into that one. So let's just say I pick the mountains and then I move this blue piece into here. A clash would start. So basically that means we're going to square up and start fighting. Before anything happens, if there is a citadel in place, then in the order of the flock of crows token, that any player who's exposed is going to have the choice of whether they want to kind of retreat into one of these citadels, kind of protecting them from the warfare. And once that's done, you are going to start basically fighting. And when you fight, you've got the ability to pick a number of maneuvers. So the first one being to attack another player. And when you attack, the other player is either going to have to withdraw a piece or remove it from the board, or discard one of their action cards, therefore limiting their options in future plays. And then the other player is going to have the ability to either fight back or to withdraw. But you can only ever withdraw into regions adjacent where you have control. So let's just say, for example, he didn't go in here and there was a combat in this region and the white player didn't want to fight anymore. He could withdraw into this region because there is nobody else there and they are actually controlling that region. But if that wasn't the case, then they could not withdraw. And the fighting is going to keep taking place until either all or some of these pieces are removed, or until the players basically call a truce and decide not to fight anymore. Of course, as the game develops, more of these sanctuaries are going to be placed onto the board. There are going to be more citadels out there, and of course more player pieces. Now, as soon as one of the endgame triggers is is fulfilled, or a winning condition is fulfilled, I should say, then the person who has that completed is going to have the option of, instead of playing one of their cards, they can choose to take one of these pretender tokens and basically reveal to the other players that they currently have one of the victory conditions completed. So for example here, the orange player is present where there are at least 6 sanctuaries. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there is an orange piece in each of those. They can say, look, I've got one of the win conditions completed. You have to stop me before the end of the round, otherwise I'm going to win the game. So that's quite a weird little mechanism there, almost like a chess or like a check or a checkmate style feel, like that you might be familiar with chess, where you have to say to the other players, I've got it won here, stop me, or the end of the game is going to actually take place. And once all players have passed in a row, then the end of the round is going to be completed, and you're going to go on to the next phase, where you'll start with the assembly phase, going through that order, determining who the new Bren is, and of course if anybody has one of these pretender tokens still in play and they still have that victory condition completed, then that player is going to be declared the winner. In case of a tie, then the Bren is going to break that tie. And of course, if somebody has 2 of the victory conditions completed and somebody only has 1, then that player is going to win the game. So hopefully the overview there gives you a good idea about how Inish plays out. And as you can tell, this game has a slightly different vibe to a lot of these dudes on the map style games, where normally it's just in your face, smashing each other with lots of different monsters and things. And I will say the thing I really like about this game is how the actions are boiled down to these few cards. So as I said, there's only ever going to be 4 cards per player plus 1 in play at any time. And of course, the more you play this game, you're going to pretty much have a good idea about what each of those cards do. So there's not a tremendous amount to remember, and you've got a good idea what other people are capable of. So I like the fact that this one is quite condensed down into those few actions and not It doesn't have a bunch of variables. It doesn't have all these different exceptions to rules and things like a lot of these other games do, where you normally have a monster that does this and another monster that does something else, and if they're together they do something else. So there isn't that rules minutia, there isn't that bloat and confusion that goes into this one. I also like the actual winning conditions of this game. So it's not like one of those games where you have to go and just smash all the other people, and the person who's murdered the most people at the end of the game is going to be the winner. This one has a slightly more distinguished and more refined feel to it, where you have to be a bit more cunning and manipulate the board to your taste and try to actually get those objectives done, and try to prevent other people from messing up your plans. Because, of course, unlike anything else out there, you've got that pretender mechanism where, again, if you have one of those conditions completed, then you have to reveal it to the other players. So you can't really pull the wool over other players' eyes and just catch them off guard. They are going to be aware that the game is going to come to an end unless they do something about it. And that just makes this game feel a little bit different than other games out there. Because there are such few cards in play at any time, you really do have to be careful about what you're drafting, because of course you want to keep getting people onto the board, but if you take one of those cards, you might give the other player an ability to veto one of your actions by taking the Geist card. Of course, they might have the ability to then move in on you and try to fight you, and if you can't defend yourself, then you're not going to be in a good position. So every draft is quite pivotal on what you can do from turn to turn. So I do like how the drafts are meaningful, and you can't just pick one and hope it kind of sorts itself out and it will work out for the best, where it just won't happen. If you don't pick a good set of cards to get you through that round, then you're going to pretty much suffer. However, I do really enjoy that tweak that I haven't seen before in drafting games, where if you have your hand of 4 cards, you pick one of them, you get the new bunch into your hand, you can actually choose to put the one you picked earlier back into the fold and go again with a new set. I love that. It's really different, and just that small tweak gives quite a big sense of flexibility and just makes you have the ability to kind of pivot and change your strategy on kind of the spin of a dime. So I really do like the way that works. Now, despite being impressed about how the game is condensed down to these action cards, I will say I have a few little issues with the game, and I think some of them are personal and some of them are a bit more of a broader scope. So first off, I find the combat in this game somewhat unsatisfying. Essentially with a game, this again, it's quite refined until the point where you end up fighting with other players. So as I said, if I move this place in, it's going to start a big scrap. And then it's basically just a big smashing party where people are going to keep discarding cards and just losing people from the board. And that can feel a bit abrupt. It can feel a bit too in your face for a game of this vibe. So I will say that it had a little bit of a disconnect for me, and I didn't find that overly satisfying or fun. I would have liked a more refined combat system and a way to get people on and off the board. So it just felt a bit too smash mouth for me, and it just didn't quite sit right. Additionally, these epic tail cards, they do vary quite a lot in what they can do, and as I mentioned earlier, some of them are quite circumstantial and some of them are pretty strong at any time. So I will say that these are generally a bit too swingy for me and a bit too powerful at times. And something I did like about this was the fact that, again, because there are so few cards in it, you always had a good idea about what people could do, and if they did do something to trick you or to get the advantage over you, then it's probably your fault because you've let that card slip through your hands. Whereas with these epic tail cards, it does have that vibe of, you didn't see this one coming, so have that. And I find that a bit annoying at times, where you couldn't foresee that this could happen. They've got this kind of trick in their pocket that they could pull out at any time and just catch you off guard with it, and there's no way that you could prepare for it. So let's just take a quick look at what some of these cards do, and there is a big deck of these for a lot of variability, I should say. So let's have a look at this Braze Tyranny card. So this one lets you move one opposing clan from one territory where you're present to an adjacent territory, and that doesn't initiate a clash. That one's quite simple. But then you get ones like this, where after you perform an attack card, you get a deed. And those deeds are extremely strong and are going to have quite a significant influence on who wins the game. Because, getting the objectives is not overly difficult, but the fact that you can get those deeds cards to proxy one of the victory conditions is extremely strong. You've got this this Dagda's Club here, where if you would remove a clan, you wouldn't have to remove it anymore. And of course, things like that, they might not seem big, but when you've planned your turn as precisely as you can, something like that can throw a real spanner in the works and just completely shift the balance to the other player. And I would have liked to have seen it being a little bit more deterministic than that. And I think, again, this is going back to a bit more of a personal vibe thing, where I tend to like area control games where you have a good idea about what can happen and people just can't throw something in your face that you just didn't see coming. So almost like the thing that makes Inish unique, some of it is great for me, such as the card drafting, and some of it is just not my style of game, where I almost would want to change the game away from being what Inish actually is, which I don't think would be fair, if that makes sense. The pacing and tempo of Inish is also pretty interesting, because although the box does say the game takes an hour to play, that is going to fluctuate quite a bit from game to game. If you have players who are really on the ball and can constantly counteract your when you take pretender tokens, then it does have the potential to go on longer than that. But of course, it can also go the other way as well, where you can actually end up getting that objective fulfilled in half an hour, 45 minutes. So I quite like the fact that this has an undetermined amount of time, how long this is going to take. It does keep you on your toes, and it does keep you engaged, and has to kind of force you to be on the ball at all times. However, be prepared that it could outstay its welcome, or at least outstay that 60 minutes that's printed on the box. But I don't think that's a negative for this game. I would say the replayability of Inish is generally pretty good, especially if you're playing with the same group, because again, if you get more familiar with these cards, then each draft is going to become more meaningful from game to game, where as in your initial games, you're probably just going to go with the flow and just draft things and try things out. But once you're familiar with each of these cards and what they can do, then you are really going to be aware about what your other players are going to go for and what's out there in the field to be played. So I do like the way that the game does reward repeated plays and has a certain richness in terms of rewarding people with increased kind of dividends the more you invest time into this one. There's also a big stretch of these epic tail cards, as I mentioned, so you're going to see different ones from game to game. You've got a bunch of these different regions, again, for a variance in gameplay. Some of them with special rules, some of them with not special rules. So yeah, there is a good amount of replayability here, should you enjoy the game. From a production and aesthetic perspective, I think this game is remarkable. I'm blown away with the way this game looks. I'm not massively a fan of these miniatures, but the artwork itself is phenomenal and the production quality is top notch. So as you can see, not only the tiles themselves look great, but these cards and the artwork on these cards is just absolutely breathtaking. I think this style of art is so unique and different out there, and it's so captivating and striking. I'd love to see this art style explored more. This is just right up my alley, and the kind of artwork that I love. I think it's just so interesting, and it just feels alive. I'm blown away with the way this game looks. It's just phenomenal. All these cards as well just all have different artwork, and it's just so beautiful. I'd actually put this kind of artwork on my wall. I think it looks that good. So yeah, I cannot fault the production or the effort that's gone into the artwork here, and I believe this was all pre-done artwork, and Inish actually ended up buying the artwork for the game, and it wasn't made for the game. But that doesn't change anything. It's still absolutely stunning to look at. I think sometimes the obstacle for this style of game is the setup and teardown, whereas Inish does get around that pretty nicely, because you do start the game on quite a small scale with just the 3 different regions and a few player pieces onto the board. And again, you don't have all that massive buffet of different miniatures and stuff that are going to come into play with a lot of these style games. You've just got the same bunch of cards. So I do like the fact that there isn't actually that many components for a game of this scope. So that keeps things nice and concise and nice and compact from game to game, which is going to be, again, a bit of one of those speed bumps that's been flattened out in terms of getting this one to the table. And in terms of scalability, I would almost definitely never play this with 2 players, and would sit in that 3 to 4 player sweet spot, probably 4 player being the ideal player count. But yeah, if you are playing with 3 players, this is still going to be a rich experience. So overall, my thoughts on Inish are generally positive. I love the card play of this game. I love how it is boiled down into a few cards. Now, not to beat that drum too many times. But I do have a few issues with it. Number one, again, the combat system is a bit too abrupt for me, and a bit too in your face. I would have liked to have seen that be somewhat refined and a bit more intelligent and a bit more Euro in its feel. And that's where I struggle with this game, because this one isn't as Ameritrashy as a lot of these other area control style games, but it's also not Euro. It's almost like a hybrid. There's some crossover between the two, and ultimately, I think if I was to play a game of this length and this style, I would always lean to something a bit more Euro, and all the things that I would change about this game would end up turning it into a game that it's not supposed to be, and would end up being something that's already in my collection, such as El Grande, for example. So yeah, all the things that I don't like about this game are just going to be enough not to not to stay in my collection and not to be something that I'm going to look at exploring too much further. Now, that being said, I think it's a wonderful design objectively. I think it's clever. I think it's interesting in terms of the winning conditions and things. Now, I really do like this this pretender mechanism, and I like the card drafting. These cards are a bit too swingy for me. They're a bit too they're a bit too in your face, a bit too unpredictable. And again, some people are going to really like that, but it's just a personal taste thing, and the style of games I like generally steer away from this style of thing. But yeah, from a production standpoint, I think it's wonderful. I think there's going to be a lot of people who enjoy this style of game. And I did enjoy it. I thought it was a fun experience, but not something that's going to stay in my collection, and not something I'm going to be looking at playing too much further, because it's just not my jam. So yeah, objectively a good game, but ultimately not quite for me because of those few little issues I had. Thank you so much for checking out this video. If you found it useful or at least somewhat entertaining, then please hit like and consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. Additionally, if you wish to support the show, because I am a one-man operation and I don't get any support from publishers, then please consider backing it on Patreon at patreon.com/chairman of the board, where you can back for as little as £2 per month. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.